Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to Troop Dupe format and taking a look at one of the most storied decks of all time, Overdose Burn. Overdose Burn is an interesting deck, and if you lived back in the day, 2007, and played Yu-Gi-Oh! Competitively, you might remember some of this. I'll try my best to break it down. It's going to be a little bit different than your traditional introduction. Team Overdose, arguably one of the best teams ever, but certainly at the time in 2007, took a deck to the New York Regionals and placed multiple members in the top 8. It was a burn-based strategy. But this was at a time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where top 8 deck lists were not universally posted, and there certainly wasn't that huge boom in popularity for deck profiles on YouTube. So Team Overdose had the deck list to their burn deck, and there was no need to publicly share it. Why trade off your trade secrets for nothing in return? Keep those to yourself and continue to do well in events. So for months and months, there was this mythical Overdose burn deck that nobody had the deck list to except the actual members of the team. Heading into the Troop Dupe format, which began in March of 2007, the actual deck in and of itself didn't see any significant limitations from the March 2007 ban list. The very first time that the Overdose burn deck saw popularity, or at least saw play from Overdose themselves, saw success specifically, was during the end of the format prior. So we're talking about in and around the time period of SJC Orlando. We actually recently profiled a Chimera Tech OTK deck from that exact time period. Well, heading into Troop Dupe format, the summer of 2007, Team Overdose saw some success with their deck list at SJC Montreal, for example, and some events after that. One of the most fascinating things, though, is that at this point in time, coverage was only posted for either the top 16 or the top 8 deck lists. It didn't necessarily always provide you the full list of deck lists. So although Team Overdose saw members place into the top of major SJCs, the actual deck list itself would not be posted. Often they lost in the very first round, and the actual deck in and of itself kind of remained that fabled mystery. Well, eventually, Adam Korn, after his win at the 2007 US Nationals, a new member of Team Overdose took the fabled Overdose burn deck to the top 8 of the 2007 World Championship. And there it was, published publicly in its entirety. It was a burn strategy that didn't fully commit to the burn strategy in game 1, meaning we're not going to be looking at a deck that has, Drama Trio and Just Desserts. It's going to be a deck that instead plays Dekoichi, Mystic Tomato, Sangan. Has cards in the side deck, though, that allow it to transition into a Monarch-based strategy, making it such that in game 1, you still have Wave Motion and Solemn Judgment and some other burn cards like Magical Cylinder, but the small burn count enables you to have that transition side, very similar to the Comic Odyssey strategy that was implemented by the end of the format and certainly into the format that followed. That strategy, though, relied on skill drain. That is not the case. This is a control-based burn strategy with a minimal number of burn cards, but plenty of card advantage cards like Mask of Darkness and Dekoichi that enable you to stall the game out and generate card advantage, and honestly just still play the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Without having to fully invest in that burn strategy. Then in games 2 and 3, you can smoke screen or transition side, potentially taking out the burn and the stall cards, simply playing Monarchs in games 2 and 3, and potentially catching an opponent off guard where their Jinzo, Royal Decree, and Death Wombat suddenly line up against Riser and Cyber Dragon. One of the most interesting decks at the time, though, because it was a mystery. Team Overdose was seeing success with the deck. People knew the deck existed. People knew that this mythical team or this great team had this deck list, but it was under wraps and nobody knew the actual deck list. It's a really fascinating deck because it took so long for it to actually be publicly released for the entire strategy to be presented, and it makes sense. If you have a transition side like this, obviously you want to keep that to yourself. I actually have a very interesting personal story about this deck. Back in the day, in the aftermath of Cyberstein's banning, on Pojo, I made a topic or thread where I discussed the viability of Benkai OTK heading into SJC Orlando. And this was a time where I wasn't traveling to Shonen Jumps. I was 15, 16 years old, yet to be any of the events in my area besides the one in Boston that I had traveled to. This is a point where I'd only ever gone to one SJC. But I commented on how, on the emergency banning of Cyberstein, how that would in the future enable OTK strategies to flourish because Wabaku, Karibo, and Threatening Roar, other types of cards of that like, would be cut from side decks, making it such that games 2 and 3, there were less resistance. Well, none other than Chris Perovic from Team Overdose actually messaged me on Facebook and AIM, to be completely honest, and told me, Team Overdose is thinking about playing an OTK-based strategy, specifically Benkai, at Orlando. Is there any way that you'd be willing to kind of take that comment down? I don't want people to really realize that vulnerability because we're potentially thinking about playing an OTK deck. Well, My mind was heading in the right direction strategically, but certainly not decklist wise, because as we recently profiled, Chimera Tech took 4 out of the 8 slots at SJC Orlando. So my 15, 16-year-old mind was actually absolutely correct. That vulnerability for OTK decks to take advantage was clearly there. Overdose was thinking the same thing. But the reason I'm telling you this story is that in exchange for taking down that thread on Pojo way back in the day, Chris Borovic actually shared with me the deck that they had been playing in the regional scenes throughout New York. So while everybody was curious, now what is this Overdose burn deck, this mythical deck? I actually, at 15, 16-year-old, totally random player from Massachusetts, actually had the deck list, at least the deck list relative to the format prior, which seeing the deck list that was played at Nationals by Adam Corrin was relatively similar, all things considered. The strategy was still there. Stealth Birds, Wave Motion Cannons, and Solemn Judgments kind of locked down game one with some minor burn with Magical Cylinders and Ring of Destruction. Stall cards here or there with that Monarch-based strategy for games 2 and 3, which is exactly what Chris shared with me way back in the day. So I have an interesting story about Overdose burn. But nevertheless, today we're going to take a deep dive look at Adam Corrin's 2007 World Championship deck list. Another option if you ever want to dive into one of my favorite formats of all time, Troop Dupe. All right, first we'll start the profile off with 3 copies of Gravekeeper's Spy and a single copy of Guard. Obviously, when we're playing this deck, we want to be as defensive as possible in game 1. The 2000 defense of Spy, and then of course the 1900 of even Guard, is sufficient to brick wall in Card Trooper, which is obviously going to be a dominant feature of Troop Dupe format. So you want to have these great defensive cards in a game when we're stalling out, trying to burn our opponent through Wave Motion Cannon. Obviously, it serves a role. It puts 2 monsters on the field for Ceasefire. And in games 2 and 3, if we do side into the Monarch package, obviously these are, and have always been, some of the best tribute fodder for those particular cards. The same can be said about Dekoichi. Dekoichi is a nice card that is a totally reasonable card. When we're playing the burn strategy, it clogs the field a little bit. And then in games 2 and 3, it's just a perfect card to tribute for a Monarch. That's always been sort of a traditional way of generating card advantage, to tribute a Dekoichi that you've just flipped for a Monarch. Then we have 2 Mask of Darkness. This would not be a card you'd see in a traditional Monarch deck. But in this deck, it's a totally reasonable card in game 2 and 3, especially if we keep in cards like Solemn Judgment, which we're going to do, and we play more traps than you would normally see in a Monarch-based deck. And then in games 1, or any game that we have the burn stuff in our deck, it allows us to recycle arguably the most powerful trap in this deck, Solemn Judgment, right? If you get to activate not just 1 Solemn Judgment, but 2, 3, 4 Solemn Judgments, 5 Solemn Judgments, because you have access to double Mask of Darkness, obviously that can be pretty fantastic. Then we have 2 copies of Mystic Tomato. Mystic Tomato is an incredibly defensive card. It also serves a role in this deck of being able to tutor Stealth Bird, right? You can crash a Mystic Tomato and summon Stealth Bird. We'll talk about Stealth Bird more in just a second. But Tomato is just another one of those cards that kind of blends between a burn-based strategy in game 1 and then having the ability to side deck into a Monarch-based strategy where we're suddenly going to want access to more traditional cards like Tomato, Dekoichi, and Spy. Stealth Bird is one of the primary ways of winning in this deck. In this particular deck, you can obviously search it off of the Mystic Tomato and then set it in main phase 2. We're going to be playing Messenger of Peace, Gravity Bind, Level Luminary B, sort of the traditional stall cards that you would see in burn strategies. Obviously, those combine really well with Stealth Bird and always have combined really well with Stealth Bird. Swords of Revealing Light as well, so double Stealth Bird. Plus, we're going to be playing Dust Shoot, so we can take a look at our opponent's hand, make sure the coast is clear, and then start to use Stealth Bird there. From that point on, there's a bunch of one-ofs. We have Spirit Reaper, which is another one of those perfect cards that sort of threads the line between, is this a burn card or is this a Monarch card? Well, Mystic Tomato is obviously going to be able to not only search a card like Stealth Bird in game 1, but then a card like Spirit Reaper in game 2. The same could be true with Sangan. So Sangan and Spirit Reaper serve a role of just totally reasonable and fine cards that can progress your game state, whether you're playing the burn strategy or have sided more into the controlling build. Then we have 1 copy of Morphing Jar. This deck doesn't necessarily have that critical mass of cards like perhaps Chain Burn does, where if you resolve a Morphing Jar, you're going to draw into so many just instant burn cards. But Morphing Jar is fantastic because you're probably going to draw into something like Solemn Judgment. And even getting another Wave Motion Cannon, Ring of Destruction, Ceasefire. And those are on-the-spot burn cards that could whittle away your opponent's life points. And then we have 1 copy of Legendary Jujutsu Master, and some of the variations of this deck. That card has gone in and out. Jujutsu Master is just another defensive card that you can set reliably, tribute for a Monarch in game 2 and 3, and be reasonably happy about that interaction. And then Adam elected to play a Lava Golem. This was a somewhat more common card in this particular deck. Anthony Alvarado played one at SJC Philadelphia that year in this particular deck. So Lava Golem, I know it's not the traditional burn deck where you look at this line and say that Lava Golem feels a little bit out of place. but it is going to serve a role in a deck that we do have some of the stall cards, like I've alluded to already, level limits, gravity bind, etc. And if we're only going to maintain the burn strategy in games 1, and potentially not in game 2 or 3, just because we're not overloading on stall cards doesn't necessarily mean a card like Lava Golem is a liability. So that's our monster lineup. For our spell lineup, we have triple Wave Motion Cannon. You know, this card is going to be a lightning rod of interaction. This is the card that, you know, as it sits there on the field, basically in every burn deck of all time, this is the card that the burn player is hoping can just tick up as high as possible, whereas the opponent is sitting there thinking about, all right, do I have to use this MST breaker? Well, breaker's not even legal in this format, but MST, do I have to use this Heavy Storm now? Do I have to use this Mobius on the Wave Motion Cannon? Or should I hold it? If there's only one removal card, like a Dust Tornado, do I use it on Wave Motion? Do I use it on Level Limit? Like, exactly how do I navigate the back row destruction? Because Wave Motion Cannon is obviously the elephant in the room as it ticks up higher and higher. And again, if we're only going to be playing the burn strategy in game 1, your opponent's not going to have a lot of outs. As a result, Wave Motion Cannon is going to be pretty good. There are cards like Ryza. That's a big issue with this deck. But for the most part, we do have 5 counter traps in our deck that can deal with Ryza. And not everybody's playing that type of card anyway. A lot of people are playing, you know, T-Hero based strategies, or in some cases, machine beatdown strategies, which might not necessarily even have access to Ryza. So Wave Motion Cannon, you're only going to be looking at maybe 3-ish outs in game 1. So that's, you know, really fantastic for the strategy. Same is going to be true with a card like Messenger of Peace, right? If your opponent only has a handful of outs in their entire deck and we've got a handful of counter traps, although this deck isn't overloading and committing fully to the stall strategy, there are easily enough cards in this deck that your opponent has to deal with, and the fact is they're not going to have it out. So double Messenger of Peace, same thing with a Swords of Revealing Light and Level Limit Area B, giving us 4 stall cards plus the Gravity Bind I'll talk about. So 5 cards in our deck have that ability to just stall the game out. Combining really well with Lava Golem, adding that inevitability to Wave Motion Cannon. We've probably all played against burn decks at some point in time, so I don't have to get in too much depth about sort of the power of a stall card in a burn deck. But this deck doesn't need to overwhelm itself by playing a ton of these things. There's no Wall of Revealing Light, for example. We only need a little bit. Same is going to be true with Scapegoats. It's a good stall card. It can be played in games 2 and 3 in a Monarch deck and be totally reasonable. Then we have a Confiscation, which is definitely more geared towards games 2 or 3. Same is going to eventually be true when you talk about Dust Shoot, but it is a great card, right? It can hit Heavy Storm out of your opponent's opening hand. It's a pretty amazing interaction. Then a Book of Moon. We don't have a ton of flip effects that we're trying to reset, like maybe Duskquala would in a traditional burn deck, but it still gets value off Mask of Darkness. You still get value off of other cards in the deck. Some interactions with Stealth Burden might value setting a monster face down. It's just a totally fine Yu-Gi-Oh card. There are enough flip effects in this deck where it could be warranted, and it is one of those cards, right? We need to have as many cards in our deck that thread that line between burn and control, and Book of Moon is just one of those perfect cards that can be flexible in either strategy. And then for the trap lineup, some of the early iterations of this deck elected to play Sakuratsu Armor. This deck is instead going to go with the triple Dust Shoot, triple Solemn Judgment lineup. So Judgment makes a lot of sense in any type of burn strategy, right? We want to negate Heavy Storm, MST, Ryza if it's potentially summoned. Triple Dust Shoot is in many ways sort of the upgraded version of Sakuratsu Armor. They both 1-for-1. Granted, it doesn't get rid of the field presence, but it gives you insight into their hand. It's a card that's perfect in either strategy, whether it's burn, slowing the opponent down of their combo pieces, or in the control build when we side into the Monarch. So Triple Dust Shoot was a huge feature of the format and is even going to be played in this burn strategy. Adam then elected to run 2 copies of Pulling the Rug. So Pulling the Rug is fantastic against every Monarch, obviously. It's reasonable against gadgets. It depends on when you use it, but it can stymie a gadget player if they only have 1 gadget going. If they have 2 gadgets, you know, the dead one in hand, all of a sudden this didn't feel that great. It's good against demise strategies because it hits all the searchers along the way. It's not that great against T-Hero specifically. It only hits, realistically, Stratos in that deck. It's not that great against DDT strategy, but you don't have to really worry about that with Magical Stone Excavation, limited to 1 in the middle of the format. So for the most part, Pulling the Rug has some target in just about every deck, and the real issue with this specific strategy was the release of Ryza and Force of the Breaker. So we need to have main deck outs to a card like Ryza if we're going to really try to commit this much to a burn strategy. And then we have just some generic cards. We have Torrential and Mirror Force, which are basically staples at this point in time in traditional decks. They obviously function really well with our control strategy. At this point in time, this card, it's kind of hard to call this card a staple throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history because it's been banned a lot. But in any format that it is legal, if you're playing a traditional trap lineup, you're definitely just going to play Ring Destruction. And this is a burn deck, so of course you can play Ring Destruction. And then some cards that are more burn-centric, which we're going to side out if we side into the control package, which is a Magic Cylinder, a Ceasefire, and then Gravity Bind. So that is our monster lineup. We do not have an extra deck built because you cannot go into the extra deck with this particular constructed deck. You would want to have one. Of course, you don't want your opponent to immediately rule out that you're on T-Hero Machine Beatdown. Both of those decks, whether it's through Overload Fusion, Future Fusion, or Metamorphosis, do access the extra deck, and Demise, of course, with Metamorphosis. So you do want to have an extra deck built, so just have any random quantity of cards. It doesn't really matter what they are. This deck cannot reasonably go into anything, so you don't need to have any specific fusions. In terms of the format, what do you have to worry about during Troop Dupe? Well, there's the Jeff Jones Little City deck, there's Gadgets, which we recently profiled, of course, Demise that we profiled, of course, Machine Beatdown that we profiled, T-Hero, which kind of threads the line when talking about cards like Card Trooper. We, of course, have DDT, we have Perfect Circle, we have Monarch decks, sometimes in the Perfect Circle build, or just with cards like Soul Exchange. Flip effects, kind of like what this deck is trying to do. We have Good Stuff decks. I think this is a pretty good encapsulation of most of the things that you could encounter during this format. How are we going to counter out that? Well, we're actually not necessarily going to target anything specifically on my mat. Instead, what we're going to do is have a transition side. We've talked about transition sides before, specifically when talking about Comic Odyssey burn. Overdose burn, OD burn is a very similar underlying strategy. So this side deck will look somewhat similar to what we talked about when we got into Comic Odyssey skill drain burn. Of course, this main deck is not as committed to the burn strategy and to the stall strategy and to sort of the prison strategy with cards like skill drain, but it is nevertheless still a strategy that has enough burn in the main deck to win game one, and then plenty of flexibility going into the sided games where we have double Cyber Dragon, triple Ryza, a Zaborg and a Mobius to give us 5 tribute monsters to go along with a Treeborn Frog, double Brain Control. We have Snatch Steal to kind of go along with the Brain Control to give us 3 ways of stealing our opponent's monsters for the sake of summoning a Monarch. We have a couple back row removal cards, which we did not otherwise have access to with MST and Heavy Storm. And then we have just 2 generically powerful cards with a Premature Burial and a Pot of Avarice. This was Adam's side deck at the 2007 Nationals, and it is a really perfect transition side. So I'm going to remove the other decks of the format just because, quite frankly, we're not necessarily siding for a particular strategy, but I am going to go through the main deck and kind of talk about the cards that stay in and stay out. So these all stay in. These have to stay in unless they're absolutely dead, but we're going to keep the Dust Shoots in. We're going to keep the Judgments in. We're obviously going to side out these 3. Book stays in, Confiscation stays in. I'm going to put Scapegoats over here because it can come out depending on your thoughts, right? There's no enemy controller. It's more just of a defensive card against something like Machine Dupe Card Trooper. We're obviously going to side out Level Limit, Swords, the Double Messenger of Peace, the Triple Wave Motion Cannon, Lava Golem, Jiu-Jitsu Master is totally reasonable. The Stealth Birds are going to be sided out. Mask of Darkness is actually fine in this deck because there's a bunch of traps. But these are the cards that absolutely get sided out. So we've got 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 13 cards that to me basically have to get sided out because they're entirely burn cards. And then if the matchup doesn't warrant pulling the rug, you could side those out. If the matchup you don't think warrants a card like Scapegoats, you could absolutely side them out. And that leaves you with, a small tomato package, Jiu-Jitsu Master, Morphing Jar, Mask of Darkness is fine, Dekoichi, and obviously the Spies all work really well with Monarch. So all of those cards look fine to me. Confiscation, Book of Moon, those cards are great. And then the trap lineup, it's a little unorthodox. You wouldn't traditionally run Judgment in this format, but it is totally fine when you look at the rest of the contents of the deck. Scapegoat, as I alluded to, could easily be sided out if you want. You could side out Jiu-Jitsu Master as well. It's not the most ideal card in this particular game 2 and 3, just because unlike Dekoichi and Spy, it doesn't really get any value off a flip summon. It has to be attacked into, and the opponent might not actually do that. So you can make those decisions right here at what I consider sort of the 2 flex slots. If pulling the rug is good against the deck you're playing against, well, then maybe side these out. If pulling the rug is bad against the deck that you're playing against, well, side those out, go to 15, and you can side these in. Luckily, basically every card over here has some space, right? Maybe a card like MST and Heavy against a strict combo deck, but as I alluded to, DDT has kind of been watered down even more than the original limitations at the start of the format with the limitation to Stone Excavation mid-format. So even against a deck like that, it's just not likely going to matter, right? You're not going to really face the style of deck. So against basically every single deck, every card in here has some value. T-Hero didn't play a lot of traps, and maybe you could argue one of these aren't as warranted as something else. But for the most part, all 15 cards can be sided in against basically every single strategy. And for the most part, they'll all have some degree of use. But nevertheless, that's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.